On Saturday, December 28, 1946, a Lockheed Constellation airliner known as the Cairo Skychief was beginning the landing sequence at Shannon Airport on the western coast of Ireland. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, so naturally it was dark, but it was also quite cloudy with low ceilings, fog, and light rain. The visibility of the crew was restricted quite a bit. But this crew was experienced, and the airport, despite being relatively new, was well known amongst international aircrews, as it was and is used regularly for both westbound and eastbound transatlantic air traffic. Its location puts it in line with most direct flights to and from Canada and the United States. Yet, oddly, as the crew was given clearance to land by the Shannon control tower and the plane turned toward the runway, the lights of the airport went dark. As the pilot struggled to compute this unprecedented turn of events, the left wingtip struck the ground. The aircraft then quickly crashed and caught fire. Of the 23 passengers and crew on board, there were 9 fatalities and 14 survivors. There were no other injuries or fatalities on the ground. The area where the plane crashed was muddy wetlands, less than 2 miles from the airport. Local fire, police, and rescue personnel arrived at the scene as quickly as possible. Yet it would take 3 days for the investigators of the Irish DIC, that's the Department of Industry and Commerce, as well as the U.S. Civil Aeronautics Administration, the CAA, to arrive at the accident site. Like so many other aircraft accidents that are featured here on Radar Contact Lost, the weather at the time of the crash played a key role. Yet it was not the sole cause or even the primary cause of the crash. It would take months for the investigators to understand what happened, but when the accident report was completed and made public, and the primary cause of the crash was revealed, it became clear that there was something much more significant than the weather that caused this crash. Of all the aviation accidents we've had here on this podcast, we've never had a primary cause of an aviation accident like this one. This is Radar Contact Lost, the podcast. I'm your host, Dave Gorham. I'm a retired meteorologist with a career in the United States Air Force, commercial and broadcast weather forecasting, with a specialty of aviation meteorology. I've created this podcast series to bring you interesting but tragic stories of airplane crashes that have either been caused by the weather or when the weather has been a contributing factor to the crash. Today's episode, when TWA Flight 6963 crashed while trying to find a dark airport, is about the crash of Transcontinental and Western Air Flight 6963 when it was attempting to land at Ireland's Shannon Airport. The flight was a multi-leg flight originating at the Paris-Orly Airport, continuing to Shannon, Ireland for fuel, crossing the North Atlantic with a second stop for fuel in Newfoundland, Canada, and then its final destination in New York at LaGuardia Airport. The crash occurred during the wee hours of December 28, 1946. We're going to examine the weather, of course, but it was not exactly a surprise to the crew. They had been updated regularly since leaving Paris. But I'll quickly say that, knowing the weather conditions were poor, the captain approached the airport cautiously, and after getting a look firsthand for himself, he decided to go ahead with the landing. For the time, in 1946, this Lockheed Constellation was a modern airliner. And like the previous episode of Radar Contact Lost, when a modern Airbus A300 flew into the ground near the Birmingham Shuttlesworth Airport in the United States, at night and in similar weather conditions, this plane in Ireland didn't just fly into the ground, at least not on its own. So we'll take a close look at the L-049 Constellation. As I mentioned, we'll look at the weather, we'll take a good look at why the airport went dark just before the plane was about to land. In fact, the lights going dark may be the most bizarre aspect of this crash, but it's not something sinister or absent-minded or even mysterious once all the details of the crash became known. But yes, we'll definitely talk about that. We'll talk about some of the safety regulations that were changed as a result of this crash. As I mentioned earlier, we've never had this type of crash or cause of this kind of crash like this before. And all I can say is it's just sad. this plane was doomed to crash before it ever took off. Then, near the end of the podcast, I'll share some new podcast statistics. We've set a couple of new download records that show a continuing momentum that the last several episodes have laid the groundwork for. So with that, let's begin and take a look at the crash of TWA Flight 6963, the Cairo Skychief, and the weather on that dark, cloudy Saturday morning on the western coast of Ireland almost 80 years ago. I mentioned at the beginning of this episode that the weather was not a surprise. And by that I mean, the plane approached the airport at 5,000 feet, then descended to 2,500 feet, then descended to 1,500 feet, and at that point, the captain flew over the north end of the field, parallel to the runway he was going to land on. That would be runway 1432. It made this pass at approximately 600 feet. That's about 180 meters. All those altitudes were radioed by the captain and were based off the plane's altimeter. The captain then noted the clouds and how they corresponded to the airport's weather observation. There was a difference. The reported airport conditions were much lower, so the aircrew basically briefed themselves on the weather conditions near and over the airfield as they arrived. The forecast that was provided to the crew by TWA and the forecast provided by the controllers at Shannon Airport included ceilings and visibility that were higher than what was reported within the airport weather observation. Conditions that were more in line with what the crew experienced when checking out the weather for themselves just before landing. However, a new forecast had been issued and it accurately reflected the lower conditions of the weather observations. This new forecast was issued before the flight departed Paris, yet for some reason, the crew did not receive this update. Nevertheless, the crew were constantly provided with the latest weather observations at Shannon while en route. The accident investigators determined later that the non-receipt of the newest forecast did not affect the conduct of this flight. In 1946, aviation weather technology was basic, but it was transforming and improving. The accurate and successful weather forecast for the D-Day invasion of France during World War II was only 2.5 years earlier. And I think that was the beginning of what would become modern aviation weather forecasting. Weather radar, the happy accident of World War II, was brand new and not widely available. Actually, I shouldn't even say not widely available because in 1946, it wasn't really available anywhere yet, especially outside of military applications. That happy accident I mentioned was because the earliest radars of the war were designed to track aircraft, not weather. Nobody was even thinking about tracking clouds. Yet while in operation, these strange blotches kept showing up on the radar screens. It took some experience to figure out that the blotches were rain showers and thunderstorms. The radar designed to track airplanes was, it was discovered, also tracking the weather. A happy accident indeed. At the time of this crash, weather technology relied on ground-based weather observations, radiosondes for upper air data, that's weather data recorded by sensors taken aloft by weather balloons, and teletype communications for forecasts. This was the state of the technology for the time, and it's what the crew of TWA Flight 6963 depended on. As I mentioned, those early weather radar systems were in their infancy, and it really wouldn't be until after the war that they started to be taken out of the military airplanes and adapted for ground-based civilian use. Although larger aircraft like the B-17 and the B-25 bombers were beginning to be outfitted with the new radar technology as the war neared its end, this technology was still several years away for civilian aircraft. In fact, early experiments with civilian airborne weather radar began in the late 1940s. The first civilian airborne weather radar was installed in 1956, and then mandatory installation of civil aircraft in the United States began in 1964. The weather in Ireland is surprisingly mild. Being on the receiving end of both atmospheric and ocean currents, Ireland's weather is strongly influenced by the Atlantic Ocean and the warm waters of the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream flows north from the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea, hugging the east coast of the United States. Then it bends to the northeast and the east and flows over toward northwestern Europe, which brings all that warm water right to Ireland's front door. With that, Ireland is rarely extremely hot or extremely cold, despite being more north than any state in the United States except Alaska, and more north than most of Europe. It also receives abundant rainfall. The western coast of Ireland can see almost 50 inches of rainfall annually. December is the wettest month, with frequent and long-lasting storms moving onshore from the Atlantic. Lots of drizzle and low clouds. Ireland is not referred to as the Emerald Isle without cause. Interestingly, one of the harshest winters for Europe was beginning to take shape at the time of this crash. The history books indicate that the winter of 1946-1947 was the most harsh of the 20th century. Record snowfall and extreme cold for weeks on end. For Ireland, temperatures plunged in mid-January and remained below zero for 42 consecutive days. That's 0 Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Of the 50 days between January 27th and March 17th, 1947, Ireland had snow on 30 of those days. As 1946 came to a close, nothing really stands out for Ireland as being particularly unusual or extreme prior to the cold plunge in mid-January. It was wet, cloudy, chilly, not really unusual for December in Ireland. At 2 a.m. local time on the morning of the crash, weather conditions at Shannon Airport, as reported by the control tower to the crew, included broken clouds at 400 feet and overcast clouds at 900 feet. In meters, that's 122 meters broken and about 275 meters overcast. Visibility was 2 miles or 3.2 kilometers, and the wind was from 120 degrees at 5 knots, almost right down the runway. Missing from that official airport observation is the visibility obstruction. But given the rest of the weather conditions, I'll guess there was a lot of fog and likely some drizzle or light rain restricting that visibility. It was also at this time that the control tower cleared Flight 6963 to land. 6 minutes later, at 2:06, the conditions had deteriorated. Now the sky was overcast at 400 feet with scattered clouds below at 250 feet. Visibility had worsened from 2 miles to just 1 mile. 2 minutes after that, now at 2:08, the aircraft passed over the north end of the field from the east and began to turn towards the runway. It was at this point that the captain was surveying the weather over the field and decided to push ahead with the landing. 1 minute later, at 2:09, observers saw a brilliant flash west-northwest of the airfield and in line with runway 14. The Cairo Skychief had crashed. We'll pick up the crash in a few minutes, but I wanted to talk about the airport because the history of Shannon Airport and its runways is interesting. This is of personal interest to me because I would brief transatlantic aircrews into Shannon on a regular basis. Shannon, on the eastern side of the North Atlantic, and Gander Airport in Newfoundland on the western side. These two airports were critical to aviators because they were the closest land airports for flights crossing the North Atlantic. Even if the aircraft was not planning on stopping at Shannon or Gander, the crew needed an idea of what the weather at both places would be, just in case. Just in case, for instance, they lost an engine and had to proceed to the nearest airport. When crossing these broad expanses of ocean, the crew would constantly update their position so they would know immediately which airport was closest, even if that meant turning around and going back in the direction from where they had just come. The area known today as Shannon Airport was first used for the large and luxurious flying boats, like the globe-trotting Pan Am Clipper series, and the large flying boats of the military, primarily the U.S. Navy. The Pan Am Clippers were at their peak in the 1930s, but as the end of the decade neared, the writing on the wall was clear. Newer planes would need land-based runways, not moorings and docks. The location on the western coast of Ireland was ideal for the flying boats, thirsty for fuel, having just crossed the North Atlantic. But at Shannon, moving the facilities to land would prove to be difficult. The entire area was nothing more than a boggy, marshy, grassy area next to an estuary. The first step of building the new airport then would be to, drain the swamp. So they did. But I thought it was surprising that the first runways at the new Shannon Airport were grass, built mainly for smaller planes. Even though the drumbeat of increasingly larger and faster transatlantic aircraft was getting louder by the day. I couldn't find exactly when the grass runways were paved over, but it must have been soon after the airport opened in 1942. It was noted that the 3 runways were extended in 1945, and I'm sure they were paved by then, or paved at that time. I was looking at the history of the airport for one reason. The plane in this crash, the TWA Constellation Flight 6963, was lining up to land on the southeast-northwest-oriented runway 1432. This runway was one of the original grass runways that was paved at some point. The crash occurred in 1946, just a few days before 1947. Yet by the late 1940s, and that's as specific as I can find, the late 1940s, the runway was no longer used. Today on Google Earth, you can still see that runway, but to me it looks like it is in serious disrepair. Officially today, Shannon has just one runway, the 2-mile-long or 3.2-kilometer-long northeast-southwest-oriented runway 0624. It's the longest runway in Ireland, and it was even long enough to be classified as one of the emergency landing locations for the space shuttle, should a mission abort be necessary. Given the predominant southwesterly winds across Western Ireland, this runway is perfectly situated to take advantage of that wind. But given the number of storm systems that pass over Ireland, I would think the no longer used runway 1432 would be a needed and often used alternative. Shannon is still a busy airport today, but the days of needing immediate fuel for the commercial airliners after crossing the North Atlantic are long since gone. So the once critical airport is not quite so critical these days. It is still for the smaller jets and whatever other aircraft are crossing the North Atlantic, but no longer for the big commercial airliners. Like everything else, I'm sure if the money justified it, the southeast-northwest runway 1432 would be repaired, extended, and opened for business. The Lockheed Constellation could land on grass runways. It wasn't ideal and they avoided it if they could, but if necessary they could land on grass. But that just blurs the timeline of when runway 1432 was paved. If the Constellation could not land on grass, then we know it would have had to have been paved prior to the crash in 1946. I checked on one more thing, just for fun. The last flight of a flying boat to cross the North Atlantic on a scheduled route happened in January of 1948. The main aircraft that replaced the flying boat was, ironically, the plane from this story, the Lockheed Constellation. Lastly, I have to add just a little bit of flying boat trivia. Would you like to guess how long a transatlantic flying boat trip might take? Tick-tock, tick-tock. It would vary, of course, but first, know that a Pan Am Clipper would have to stop several times for fuel on this journey. Now, if you guessed this trip took more than a day, you would be right. The typical flight of 24 to 30 hours would go from New York to Gander for fuel, then southeast from Gander to the Azores, which is west of Portugal in the Atlantic Ocean. They would stop there for fuel and a rest, and then they would go northeast to England. This route was chosen to, quote, break up the journey for the passengers, unquote. And by the way, those flights in today's dollars were about $7,000 to $8,000. And here's yet another personal note for me and more flying boat trivia for you. And that's that the flying boat service that originated out of New York originated from my hometown of Port Washington. And this is news to me. Port Washington, New York is a small coastal town on the north shore of Long Island. Port is just a short or relatively short car drive from New York City, but more likely, the flying boat passengers took the train out from the city. When I was much younger, my mother and I would go to the Port Washington town dock and watch all the seaplanes coming and going and enjoy lunch on the water. But neither one of us knew about the history of the flying boats from about 40 or so years before. A few minutes ago, we talked about the weather conditions at the Shannon Airport at the time of the crash, and in a moment, we'll talk about the crash itself. But here's something that I thought was important, yet it was buried in a long chapter in the accident report entitled simply, Discussion. And it was important enough that I thought it should be addressed in its own chapter, and that is, why did the Cairo Skychief pilot proceed with the landing? We've talked a lot about IFR and VFR conditions in previous episodes, and not that you all are experts on that topic, but as I was describing the weather conditions earlier, perhaps you thought something like, isn't 401, isn't that pretty low? Shouldn't the airport have been closed or restricted to arriving aircraft? That's an excellent point. According to TWA, the Shannon minimums for its aircraft, including the Constellation, are 502. Yet the captain seemingly disregarded company policy and proceeded with the approach anyway, despite being 401. This is the beginning of the crash sequence, and I'm going to bring this up again. But I have to jump to the post-crash investigation first. Earlier, I set the stage by saying that the Cairo Skychief had reached the airport and overflown the north side of the airport parallel to the landing runway, but perhaps a half a mile or 800 meters off to the side. I could make an argument that, given the weather conditions, the pilot wanted to see the conditions for himself before beginning the approach to land, but it appears this flight path was part of the standard approach to the runway. As the plane continued, the crew briefly turned on its landing lights and then quickly turned them off, and at this point the plane turned to the northwest and disappeared back into the clouds. A few moments later, the plane broke out of the dense clouds at the approach side of the runway. But as the captain was turning toward the runway to land, the lights of the airport suddenly went out, and just a moment later, the plane's left or port side wingtip struck the ground. Then the rest of the plane crashed down and caught fire. In a perfectly timed bit of safety precaution, passengers in the Cairo Skychief were told to fasten their seatbelts just before landing. And fortunately, most were belted as the plane crashed. However, many on the plane, including the pilots, were thrown clear of the Constellation as it crashed. Seatbelt use for the airlines in the United States did not become mandatory until 1971, and at that time it was only for takeoffs and landings. Seatbelts were mandated for installation into commercial aircraft in 1928, but their use was not mandated. The remains of the burning plane came to rest on a small parcel of land next to the airport. It was a marshy, boggy kind of island in line with the runway. This island, named Innis McNaughton, is separated from the airport by a small channel that opens up to the River Fergus. Able-bodied and uninjured passengers and rescuers had to struggle through nearly waist-deep mud to either reach solid ground near the airport or, for the rescuers, to reach the wreckage itself. Undoubtedly, this was a very peculiar situation. This modern aircraft, under the control of an experienced crew, disregards company guidelines about the ceiling and visibility and lines up to land at a modern and new airport. Then the lights of the airport go out and the plane crashes. The investigators will certainly have their hands full trying to figure this out. Investigators determined that there was no evidence of mechanical failure or the malfunction of any major aircraft structure. They also quickly determined that neither the air traffic controllers nor anybody else at the airport turned the lights off just as the plane was attempting to land. In fact, the lights did not go off at all. They remained on the whole time. The fire destroyed most of the plane, and what wasn't burned was basically disintegrated by the impact. The engines were determined to be running and functioning properly at the time of the crash, and though the control system was considerably damaged by fire, it could be determined that there was no evidence of malfunction. There was no evidence of failure or malfunction in the hydraulic, fuel, electrical, or air conditioning systems. The plane's 3 altimeters were all set very close to the last reported altimeter setting based off the airport's barometer. But this is where the investigators began to find concerning information. In the previous episode of Radar Contact Lost, the one about the United Parcel Service A300 that crashed into a field about a mile short of the Birmingham Shuttlesworth Airport in Alabama, in that episode we talked about altimeters, altimeter settings, and the difference between above ground level and mean sea level. I don't want to repeat all of that now, but there are a couple of things that I should mention here. First, the altimeter on the aircraft indicates the plane's altitude. However, for the instrument to be fully accurate, the aircrew has to adjust the altimeter based on the altimeter setting provided by the control tower at the local airport. In this case, the altimeter setting on the Cairo Skychief was close to the altimeter setting, but it was not set perfectly. This discrepancy caused the investigators to look more closely at the plane's altitude and the altimeter. And again, the plane had 3 altimeters, one for each pilot and likely one for the flight engineer. Each altimeter has to be set manually each time they receive a new altimeter setting from air traffic control. This is true today, just as it was in 1946. Armed with information that pointed at the altimeters, the investigators traced the static lines from the primary and alternate sources to their connections behind the pilot's and co-pilot's instrument panels. These static lines, or the pitot static lines, are tubes that are directly exposed to the outside air. If you've heard of a pitot tube before, then you know it is what drives the airplane's airspeed indicator. It's simple. The air from outside the plane rushes into the pitot tube, and the internal pressure within the tube causes the airspeed indicator to react. The altimeter works off this same air pressure, although that may vary between airplanes. Inside the altimeter, a sealed aneroid barometer expands with lower pressure and contracts with higher pressure. That aneroid is connected to gears and levers that drive the indicator needles of the altimeter that then indicate the altitude of the aircraft to the aircrew. Aneroid barometers are quite common. If you have a barometer in your home, one that hangs on the wall or sits on a table, and has a needle that swings across a dial with indications for fair, changing, and stormy, or something similar, then what you have is an aneroid barometer. At all the airport weather stations where I have worked, there has always been a mercurial barometer as the primary and an aneroid as the secondary or backup barometer. Now, that was a number of years ago. Today, barometers are digital, meaning the pressure is sensed by a small electromechanical device similar to an aneroid barometer. It deforms under changing atmospheric conditions, and then it displays the barometric pressure digitally. Okay, well, we've kind of gotten away from the crash. Let's get back to that. I had just told you that the investigators traced the static lines to their connections behind the cockpit instrument panels for the pilot and the co-pilot. And earlier I mentioned that for some reason, the aircrew disregarded company policy and decided to land at an airport that was below minimums. And, oh yes, the lights of the airport were turned off, except they weren't. Turns out, what the investigators discovered addresses all of those things. Now, it's not correct at all to call the reason for a deadly plane crash simple. Most times they're quite complex. But it was a simple mistake by the maintenance crew that caused the Cairo Skychief to crash. The investigators discovered that the pitot static lines were hooked up backwards. This caused at least 2 of the 3 altimeters, the ones viewed by the pilot and co-pilot, to read too high. So even though the altimeters were set nearly correctly, the backwards hookup caused the altimeters to display the incorrect altitude. In other words, the crew thought they were higher than what they actually were. Therefore, when the crew overflew the other side of the airfield, their instruments indicated that the clouds, based on the altimeters of the plane, were higher than what they were actually being reported. So the crew was not disregarding company policy outright about the airport minimums, because to them, they were above the minimums. Still, the airport weather observation is the official report of the weather conditions at the airport. It is not correct for the crew to decide that the weather observation is wrong and then determine their own cloud layers. This same issue with the altimeters is responsible for the perceived understanding by the pilot and co-pilot that the airport lights were turned off. What actually happened was that the plane descended below and behind a hill that blocked their view of the airport. Because the crew thought they were higher than what they actually were, they did not know they were lower than the hills that were off the approach end of the runway. And because it was dark, cloudy, and foggy with rain, they couldn't see the hills to have the proper perspective of what was happening. To the crew, the airport lights were on and then they were off. Then, as they were trying to figure out what was happening, they ran into the ground just less than 2 miles away from the runway. Investigators estimated that due to the reversal of the static lines, there was between 125 and 185 feet of error in the altimeter indications. That's 38 meters to about 56 meters. When landing an airplane at night in poor weather conditions, that's a really big error. Those numbers are estimated because the altitudes of the Cairo Skychief are based in part on the instruments, but also on statements from the witnesses on the ground, as well as the 2 pilots who both survived the crash, and the possible error of the airport barometer upon which the airplane's altimeters were set. When considering the altimeter error and the other circumstances, it's possible the height of the Skychief could be off by as much as 300 feet. So when the pilot thought the overflight of the field occurred at 600 feet, it was actually 300 feet. 300 feet is about 91 meters. Again, that's a really big error. As the plane turned toward the airport, the pilot thought they were at 500 feet, but were actually at 200 feet. In the pitch dark, without any visual references, and without the landing systems that we take for granted today, the pilot had to make the turn toward the airport solely off instruments. And in what can be blamed only as pilot error at the worst possible time, the pilot lost 150 feet of altitude while making that final turn. The final loss of altitude allowed the plane to slip behind a hill that lay directly behind the airplane and the airport. To the crew, it appeared the airport lights were turned off. They couldn't see the hill, they didn't know what they hit. One more thing, as if this wasn't bad enough. When the plane began to turn toward the runway, the windows of the cockpit fogged over, further reducing the pilot's view of the airport and the land below. This was in the days before dual-pane windows, but not before heating elements or defrosters. This new airplane did not have heating elements built into the windshield, but it must have had defrosters. However, apparently, defrosters that were not turned on. I'm sure you've experienced something similar while driving your car. The temperature outside drops, causing the relatively warm and humid air on the inside of your car to condense on the cold windshield. You turn on the defroster, and a minute or 2 later, the windshield clears as the warmer air dries the condensation. That same thing happens in an airplane. Imagine the cold temperatures outside the plane at 5,000 or 7,000 feet. Then the plane descends to a few hundred feet above the ground as it prepares to land, and warm, humid air near the ground is drawn into the airplane. This airplane did not have air conditioning, so that relatively warm, humid, oceanic air condensed onto the inside of the plane's cold windshield. Later versions of the Constellation had heating elements installed around the windshield to make the heat more or less instantaneous. but this plane only had defrosters, and they were necessary to battle icing at the higher altitudes where this constellation flew. Though the post-crash accident report didn't specifically mention this, it seems to me that another mistake here is that the defrosters of the Cairo Skychief should have been turned on, and turned on well before the windshield began to fog over. Although, with additional thought, it makes me think that the Cairo Skychief's defrosters were turned on. I'm sure they had to be used in the colder temperatures at the higher altitudes. So what happened? Did the pilots turn off the defrosters, but there was enough humidity and warmth in the air to fog over the windshield inside the cockpit as the plane neared the ground? There were a couple of things about this crash that I wanted to check in with Captain Michelle about. Captain Michelle, as our regular listeners know, is one of the advisors here on Radar Contact Lost. She is a retired FedEx pilot and was a U.S. Air Force fighter pilot and instructor pilot before that. She's a good friend, too. The first question I had for her is, what happens when a pilot disregards company policy? I think, as we know by now, the pilot of the Cairo Skychief did not disregard company policy as he thought he was well above those minimums. Except, and this is a biggie, the official airport weather observations were indeed below TWA landing minimums. And that's what matters. It's when the captain overflew the north side of the airport and made his own determination that conditions were acceptable based on his airplane's erroneous altimeter that he decided to go ahead with the landing. I think any lawyer will tell you that he violated company policy. So I asked Captain Michelle, can the pilot just disregard company policy like that? She said that the minimums established by the company are controlling or regulatory, not just guidelines. Meaning, if the incident is known, then there will be discipline. But she also said that a lot of the time, if nothing goes wrong and only the controller and the pilot know about it, it can be or may be overlooked. That said, if the incident is reviewed, the sequence of the events can usually be reconstructed, and if policies were violated, then there will be discipline. That can be a demotion or retraining. From there, it may be a matter of revoking the pilot's license. She added that in many cases of disregarded company policy, that results in a crash, and that often leads to a dead pilot. So there is no longer a license to revoke. Moving on. I then asked her if losing 150 feet of altitude in a turn is normal. That didn't sound right to me. She said the pilot must compensate for the turn by lifting the nose of the airplane. If the pilot simply banks the airplane, there will be altitude loss. However, if the pilot compensates by adding enough rear rudder in the opposite direction of the turn, the nose will lift and the altitude loss will be arrested. That's a normal part of flying. A banked turn requires input by the pilot at the wheel or the control yoke, which operates the ailerons at the trailing edge of the wings, and also the foot pedals, which operate the rudder at the back of the airplane. With no visual references, at night, in the rain and fog, and with no electronic or visual landing aids, even something as basic as runway lights, losing altitude in a turn is something that can happen. It's easy to let the altitude loss get away from you. But keeping an eye on the altimeter is imperative. A skilled pilot will not let altitude loss interfere with landing at a runway. And actually, losing altitude while turning toward the runway is likely what the pilot was attempting to do. But again, he was 300 feet higher than what he thought he was. He may have even felt he was too high, and so was dropping that altitude intentionally, unaware of the hill standing between the plane and the runway. Let's talk about the air crew for a moment. Anytime we're talking about pilots in 1946, I have to think about World War II and wonder if they were Army pilots. My research indicated that Captain Herbert Tansey and First Officer Clifford Sparrow were experienced TWA pilots. 33-year-old Captain Tansey had 2,964 total flight hours, with 104 hours in the Constellation. First Officer Sparrow had a little bit less, 1,978 hours, with just 70 hours in the Constellation. I couldn't find anything about their war experience, the co-pilot's age, or anything about their pre-TWA experience. Captain Tansey had flown the route before and was familiar with Shannon Airport. Both survived the crash, but with serious injuries. And although inexperience was not cited as a factor, neither of these pilots were overflowing with experience in the Constellation. Combined, they had just 174 hours in the type. Captain Tansey and First Officer Sparrow were American citizens, and given the age of Captain Tansey, I'll assume that he did have flying experience in the war, but I couldn't find anything more on the crew, which to me is surprising. I understand that the crash happened in 1946, but with the accident investigated by both the Ireland Department of Industry and Commerce and the American Civil Aeronautics Board, I'm just surprised there is nothing else listed about their experience. Let's talk about the aircraft for a moment. The plane in this crash is what is now considered to be the iconic Lockheed Constellation L-049. It's a plane that is visually striking, but if you can't recall what a Constellation looks like, then let me tell you it's the one with the triple tail design, the only commercial airliner to ever feature such a design. Perhaps that helps clue you in, but if you're still drawing a blank, then a quick Google search will fix you up. I'm sure when you see it, you'll say, oh, so that's a Constellation. With the triple tail configuration and the fuselage appearing to have the gentle shape of a dolphin sloped back, it looked like no other airplane in the sky. Even the plane's nose has the look of a dolphin. It was unique, modern, distinctive, and attractive. For the time, it oozed power and sophistication. Some would say it even had grace. It began life as a design on paper designed to cross the United States without stopping, and as a plane that would convince the public to fly rather than take the train. And the design worked. Although, as World War II broke out at about the same time, all the Constellations built during World War II went straight to the U.S. Army. The Constellation was the first commercial airliner to fly with a pressurized cabin. This allowed not only greater comfort for the passengers, but it allowed the plane to fly at high altitudes, notably altitudes that allowed the plane to fly above most weather problems. In addition to its triple-tail design and cabin pressurization, it also had reversible propellers. This was uncommon in 1946, but it was gaining in popularity. Reversing the propellers would allow the plane to land on shorter runways by creating a reverse thrust, and it became more maneuverable on the ground. These traits made the Connie ideal for smaller airports and shorter runways. But being able to reverse the propellers was complex, and it was expensive. The new four-engined airplane first flew with the United States Army Air Corps beginning in 1943. After the war, production continued as the plane was modified for civilian use. TWA took delivery of the first one in 1945. The four engines allowed the plane to fly at a maximum speed of 375 miles per hour. That's 600 kilometers per hour. The triple-tail design was about more than good looks. It packed the larger control surfaces that a plane of this size required into a smaller, lower tail section that allowed the airplane to fit into existing hangars. Remember, transoceanic and round-the-world flights were only just beginning, and the larger planes needed for this new and exciting capability required ever-expanding infrastructure to support it and them. It was a real win for the Constellation to fit into hangars that were already open for business, without any modification. If you've ever seen a B-52 Stratofortress tucked away in a hangar, all of that airplane inside but with its tail sticking outside from the hangar doors that otherwise would close in the rest of the big bomber, then you know what I mean. If you're familiar with the plane in this story, the Constellation, then you may also be wondering about the larger Super Constellation, or what's known affectionately as the Super Connie. The Super Connie was more well known because the production numbers for the Super were much greater, and it's probably what most of us remember when considering the history of the Constellation in the annals of propeller aviation. The Super Connie was, well, larger, the fuselage was stretched, the engines were bigger, the windows were bigger, it carried more gas, and it had more modern amenities as compared to the regular Constellation. Amenities like reclining seats and air conditioning. Depending on the configuration, it could carry 47 to 106 passengers, and it was faster than most other aircraft of the time. After the war, the civilian version of the Super Connie was super successful and dominated the sky for decades. It was so successful that it was even used as Air Force One for American President Dwight Eisenhower. 2 Super Connies were used for presidential duty between 1953 and 1961. They were named Columbine II and Columbine III. Columbine II was the first aircraft used by a U.S. president to use the call sign Air Force One. This began in 1954 after a near disaster between the president's plane and an Eastern Airlines plane, both of which were carrying the same flight number. Columbine III is displayed now at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. If you are so inclined, this aircraft is available to walk through, something I have done and highly recommend. The museum's presidential gallery displays 10 former presidential aircraft, 4 of which can be walked through for an up-close and personal tour. The civilian version of the Constellation flew for just over 20 years, but almost as soon as it first took to the skies, the stretched Super Connie started pushing the smaller sibling aside. It wasn't much longer after that the new jetliners came to dominate the skies. By the middle 1960s, the Connie and the Super Connie were showing their age, and the last commercial flight of a Super Connie took place in 1968. Lockheed built 88 L-049 Constellations and 579 L-1049 Super Constellations. More than half of those went to the military. Generally, the Connie and the Super Connie were considered safe aircraft. The smaller L-049 had at least 10 major accidents between 1945 and 1949, shortly after the plane became a civilian. Overall, Constellation variants had over 150 incidents or accidents, often due to engine issues or maintenance issues like this one. This particular plane, the one that crashed at Shannon, was called, depending on the source, either the Cairo Skychief or the Star of Cairo, both names lending an air of mystery and elegance. It had 1,098 hours on the airframe and was in good working order. There were no outstanding maintenance or mechanical issues. Today, there are only 2 Super Connies still flying. As far as I can tell, there are none of the smaller Constellations that are still airworthy. One of the Super Connies is in Australia and the other is in the United States. I consider myself lucky to have seen the American Super Constellation, tail number November 422 November Alpha, land and then taxi into place at the 2025 EAA AirVenture Air Show in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, just a couple of months ago. On the same trip to AirVenture, I stopped at the Combat Air Museum in Topeka, Kansas. There, I walked aboard their Air Force Super Connie that is on static display. I was very interested to learn that this particular plane had been assigned to Homestead Air Force Base in southern Florida as an early warning and electronic reconnaissance aircraft. Most of its missions were to and near Cuba. Of special interest to me is that it had been retired from service just a few years before my wife and I were stationed at the same Air Force base. There's one more Super Connie that I should tell you about. This one hasn't flown since 2005, but it may be on the verge of flying at any time. Named the Star of America, it's located in Kansas City and was purchased last year, 2024, by John Travolta's company, Constellation Productions Incorporated. The current restoration has brought all 4 engines online, and with running engines was even pulled out of the hangar for a successful taxi test. However, despite all the recent restorations, the plane has yet to leave terra firma. I reached out to the John Travolta Corporation for a comment on the most updated status of the vintage Super Connie, but I have not had a reply. Oh, and let me add one more bit of information here, but this time information about the airline rather than about the aircraft. Perhaps you noticed at the beginning of this episode that I referred to TWA as Transcontinental and Western Air. Still TWA, but perhaps that's not how you remember it. Transcontinental and Western Air was how the company was founded in 1930. The more familiar name for TWA, Trans World Airlines, came about in 1950. Several months after the name change, the new Trans World Airlines ordered 10 Lockheed Super Constellations, which were then delivered in 1952. Late in 1953, TWA began to offer the first non-stop transcontinental air service across the United States, finally bringing to fruition its paper design of crossing the United States back in the late 1930s. But unfortunately, it was only a one-way transcontinental flight, eastbound. It was American Airlines that was the first to offer round-trip non-stop transcontinental service, and it began that just 1 month after TWA began offering the one-way transcontinental service. I would think that should be considered a blunder by TWA. American Airlines used the Douglas DC-7, not the Constellation, for this new and historic service. And in the long run, the DC-7 was faster, more reliable, and cheaper to produce than the Connie. But the Connie was certainly more beautiful than the more traditional DC-7. And now, more than half a century later, I think it's more memorable too. If you'd like more information about the Super Connie, check out ConnieSurvivors.com. And since we're talking about the plane, let me also take a moment to talk about the passengers on this plane. There was no information about the passengers per se, other than that there were 14 passengers on board and 5 of them were killed. And let me add an asterisk there on that number, the number being 5 passengers killed. There was no information that I could find about how the plane was configured, as some of the Connies were configured for luxury and some mixed passenger economy with first class. But even if this was primarily a first class type of flight, there was likely ample room for twice the number of passengers. Economy wasn't really a thing back then. Flying for the masses was still a decade or two away. But there were Connies built for luxury, and there were those that were built to maximize the number of passengers on board. Nothing I could find indicated what type of flight this was. However, and this is where the asterisk comes in, it was noted that there were 9 crew members and that 4 were killed. If there were 3 crew in the cockpit, the 2 pilots and the flight engineer, then that leaves 6 flight attendants for what would become a luxurious cabin crew to passenger ratio of about 7 passengers to 3 crew members. Since the plane left at midnight from France, perhaps it's reasonable to expect a few empty seats, but I wonder if this was a flight decked out for luxury, or was it just a nearly empty transatlantic flight heading back to the USA? Oh, and there was nothing mentioned about the flight engineer. Was he on board? Was he killed? Did he survive? The accident report has a full chapter entitled Flight Personnel, but it addressed only the captain and the first officer. The Constellation and the Super Constellation both required a flight engineer to monitor the complex systems and the 4 engines. There's no way a transatlantic flight would depart without him. So he was there. We just don't know what happened to him. I find this a peculiar oversight. Here are the findings of the investigation, as noted in the Civil Aeronautics Board Accident Investigation Report made public in April 1947. Having a localizer glide path or instrument landing system, commonly referred to as an ILS, installed at Shannon would have undoubtedly helped, likely even prevented this crash. It was slated for installation immediately following the crash of the Cairo Skychief. So too, high-intensity approach and runway lights. Because the pilots both survived, they noted in their post-crash interview that one of the things they had to contend with while landing was the visibility restrictions, not from the clouds, fog, and rain outside the plane, but from the condensation on the windows of the cockpit inside the plane. The change to heated elements on or along the windshield was implemented immediately and could be managed with only minor assembly line changes. It was noted that the instrument panels for the pilot and the co-pilot were removed for inspection during a routine maintenance check about 2 weeks before the crash. During the reinstallation, the primary and secondary static lines were mistakenly and inadvertently reversed. No test of the static lines was performed after the routine maintenance, although the maintenance forms indicated that the test had been performed. This seems to open a whole new can of worms to me, but nothing further regarding the falsified maintenance records was mentioned. Here's what the problem was with the backwards connections on the altimeter static lines. The backwards part was that the primary static line was connected to the secondary static pressure source, and the secondary static line was connected to the primary static pressure source. So when the altimeter switch was in the primary selection, it was drawing static pressure from the secondary pressure location. Altimeters have a primary static pressure source and a secondary static pressure source in case something happens to one source or the other. For instance, if the primary source, the pitot tube, ices up, the pilot can switch to the secondary source. In the case of the Constellation L-049, this means the alternate location was the wheel well of the front or nose landing gear. When the landing gear is extended, with airspeed between 150 to 160 miles per hour, an altitude error of up to 185 feet, again that's about 56 meters, can be expected. That's a large consideration. Again, when the landing gear is extended with an airspeed between 150 and 160 miles per hour, an altitude error of up to 185 feet can be expected. Without knowing the lines were reversed, the primary switch was sourcing from the nose gear wheel well, complete with the altitude issue, and the captain did not know. Given all the possible errors for the Cairo Skychief on this flight, it was determined that the error was approximately 300 feet. That's 91 meters. The crash of Flight 6963 highlighted the need for rigorous maintenance checks on critical systems like altimeters, which contributed to broader post-war safety standards in instrument installation, maintenance, and testing. Similar errors were noted and prevented in future designs. At the beginning of this episode, I noted that it took 3 days for investigators to arrive on site, but there was no further explanation of that in the accident report. So I started to think about what that could possibly mean. Flying from America for the CAB, the Civil Aeronautics Board, that was probably at least a day in transit. It may have even taken a day to summon the CAB from America. And then, if Shannon Airport was closed due to the crash, a period of a couple of hours on a third day to drive over from perhaps Dublin. As for Ireland's Department of Industry and Commerce, they were right there in country. They should have been able to arrive sooner, but perhaps they were waiting for the acknowledged authorities to arrive. After all, it was an American plane owned by an American airline and flown by an American crew. And one more thing, and this goes back to the asterisk that I mentioned concerning the fatalities of the passengers on Flight 6963. When the accident report was released in April, 4 months after the crash, there was an amendment attached to the report. It listed that there were 9 passengers, not 5, killed. On board Flight 6963, there were 14 passengers and 9 crew. There were 9 fatalities, 14 people survived. That's all for this time on Radar Contact Lost, the podcast. Thanks for listening, but don't go just yet. I want to share some podcast statistics with you. Our most recent episode, when UPS Flight 1354 crashed into the ground more than a mile from the runway, smashed the previous 7-day download record, which was held by the episode uploaded just prior to that one when TransCanada Flight 810-9 was on fire, losing altitude, and lost over the Cascade Mountains. The 30-day download record shows a similar trend, with the more recent episode topping the previous one. Then there's the 90-day download trend, and it shows each of the previous 6 episodes topping the previous one. The all-time download record holder is Season 2, Episode 2, when Colgan Air Flight 3407 fell out of the sky in Buffalo, New York. Thanks for your downloads and listens, and for pushing these episodes up in the ratings. On Instagram, follow @RadarContactLost Podcast. There I provide behind the scenes, time schedules, interesting factoids, pictures, and more. We're on Facebook too. If you'd like to reach out, send an email to rclpodcast1@gmail.com. That's rclpodcast1@gmail.com. Or send a text through your podcast app. Your name and contact information used on the texting app remains anonymous. Leave a review and a like if you can, because that helps bring this podcast to other listeners who haven't found it yet. With each new episode of Radar Contact Lost, I will bring you interesting but tragic stories of plane crashes from around the United States and from around the world. When these crashes involve the weather as a possible cause or as a contributing factor, I'll rely on my 40-year career as an Air Force, broadcast, and commercial meteorologist with a specialty of aviation meteorology to explain what happened and why. I'll also lean on my experts in meteorology, air traffic control, and piloting to peel back the curtain to take a closer look at what really happened. Lastly, let me again thank you, the listeners. And I'd like to take this opportunity to give a quick shout out to some of our newest listeners in Motherwell, North Lanarkshire in the UK, Bangkok, Thailand, Sollentuna in Sweden, and High Prairie in Alberta, Canada. Welcome aboard, new listeners. I'm excited with every upload of every new episode, and I hope you are too. I'm very happy to bring these stories to all of you who have a love of weather, aviation, and history, just like me. Thanks for climbing aboard and settling in for the latest from the Radar Contact Lost team of Chris, Cindy, Michael, Tony, First Officer Larry, Captain Michelle, and me. I'm Dave Gorham.